Greetings, everyone. I want to welcome you to our January 2023 edition of our Third Thursday training here with the Harvest Baptist Association. Every month we get to do an interview with somebody, sometimes from inside our association, and what God is doing there in their church and maybe through some ministries that they're involved in. We also get to bring in some outside folks who we feel might be an encouragement, might bring something of value for you. Certainly those of you who are present with us, but also those of you who might be watching a little bit later. And so this afternoon, we are pleased to welcome Ryan Bishop. Ryan is the lead pastor at Redeemer Church in Graham, Texas. And I'm going to let Ryan, if you'll tell us just a little bit about yourself, about your family, about your church, maybe about a little bit of ministry background, where you've been and where you are now.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to come on. Dave, you're doing a great job. You're really good at this.
Thanks, man.
For the football games too, right? You're announcing all that. Is that
that's exactly right. I didn't give you the stadium intro though.
I wish you would. I wish you would.
Yeah, maybe next time we'll roll that.
Well, good to be here. My name is Ryan Bishop. I was raised with my brother by my mom in Arlington, Texas. I grew up there around a big family in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, really close to cousins and aunts and uncles. Didn't know my dad until I was 27 years old. Growing up, I was not interested in school. I loved sports. I was a soccer player, and that was kind of my only focus was playing. I was converted by the Lord at age 21. I was on Highway 6 driving from College Station back home to Arlington when I was convicted of my sin and need for Christ. I was believing on him based upon the one sermon I had ever heard when I was 11 years old, the one time I had ever been to church. So 10 years later, I had still remembered kind of the basic facts of the gospel, believed not just those facts, but believed I needed Christ and believed that he would save me. A year later, I was baptized into membership at Field Road Baptist Church in Arlington. I'm married to Kelly for the last almost 21 years. We have 5 children. My oldest is Caleb. He's 13. All the way down to Kira, who is 5. My boys are playing soccer, and I coach them in soccer. They're also in basketball season now. We're having a lot of fun with that. And all my girls are in dance. As far as ministry, so I was initially in the communications industry. I worked in public relations and advertising. Then went to law school, and it was in the middle of law school that I started to become more and more interested in ministry in the church, and started to consider what it would mean to be called to ministry. And with the help of those who were discipling me through prayer, I ended up pursuing that. Went to Southern Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky. Did an internship after I was done in Washington, D.C. at Capitol Hill Baptist Church. And then served on staff for a year as an associate pastor of Kenwood Baptist Church in Louisville, before then coming here 13 years ago to Graham, where I've been for the last 13 years at Redeemer Church. That's the overview.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Well, I've known Ryan for 4 years, maybe some 5 years, somewhere around that range. And the way that I got associated with Ryan, I was through a couple of different avenues. One is a group of like-minded pastors, the Brazos River Ministerial Association, or Alliance. Is it Alliance? Is that what it is? Are we in Alliance?
We call it the Baptist. Sorry, I don't even know what it is. The Brazos River Ministers Association.
Okay, so we're an association.
BRMA. Yeah.
That's all right.
That's what
So
we are.
through that, and we meet once a quarter and just fellowship together, get to encourage one another, but also through the Charles Simeon Trust that puts on preaching workshops, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. We'll get to that, but it's because of that connection that I wanted Ryan to join us and talk about just the priority of preaching. And so, Ryan, if I could ask you, preaching is kind of a central part of what we do, certainly in our Baptist association, but even in the broader world of evangelicalism. When you think about church, you think of preaching. You know, the reason that Catholic churches have the altar there kind of highlighted is the Eucharist is the center of what they do. The reason that evangelicals have a pulpit is that preaching seems to be the center of what we do. So why would you say that preaching is so important? Why do we spend so much time talking about it and writing about it? And we take classes on it. We go to conferences. We have things like this where we talk about preaching. What's the big deal about preaching?
Yeah. Well, I guess I would say, first of all, one of the big deals about preaching is that many people are saved by listening to preaching, not just in the Bible, but today. So I was saved. That's part of my answer is I was saved based on a single sermon that I heard as an 11-year-old, thinking about it still when I was 21 with God's help. So there's that. There's what's happened in history through preaching, but I think the big deal with it probably, when I think of why it's a big deal to me as a pastor, I think about how it's such a big deal to God. So I think of specific passages in Scripture where it seems like it is God's priority that pastors would preach. So if I could just read some of these verses, 2 Timothy 4, the Apostle Paul is going to die soon, and he's talking to Timothy, the senior pastor of the church in Ephesus. And this apostle's dying desire is expressed in 2 Timothy 4, where he says, and listen to the weight of this, and I feel the weight of this as a pastor. I charge you in the presence of God and of Christ Jesus, who is to judge the living and the dead. And I charge you by his appearing and his kingdom. And here's the charge: preach the word. Be ready in season and out of season, reprove, rebuke, and exhort with complete patience and teaching. And then not only does he so soberly call us with the weight of the appearing of the King, with the weight of he's in the presence of God and of Christ our Savior, and this is what they all want us to hear. This is what they all want us to do, is to preach the word. It's interesting, right after that he says, because, or for, the time is coming when people will not listen. Preach the word. And here's why: because the time's coming when people will not listen. Sound teaching. So you know, as a pastor, there's all kinds of priorities we can come up with. There's all kinds of things we could do or like to do. And one way we may be thinking about what I want to do is, well, what will the people want? Because I naturally just want to feel better about myself. I don't want to start doing something and that make my church smaller and then just say, well, then I should make sure I just keep on doing that. But that's exactly what Paul says, that people are going to wander away and listen to other things that will ruin them. So therefore, you need to preach the thing that will save them. And that needs to be your focus. And when Paul says that, it's right after he's told Timothy those well-known verses about Scripture being actually coming from God and being profitable and being necessary to complete the man of God. And And he said, the scriptures are able to make you wise for salvation. So preaching seems to be a big deal to God, because preaching the Bible is what saves people. It makes people, it gives them the wisdom they need in order to believe in Christ. And God just does so very much with the preached word. Can I give you another
Yeah,
passage?
for sure.
Okay. So the other passage that encourages me is 2 Corinthians 4. This encourages me because in verses 1-6, Paul, I just feel like I'm resonating with Paul, and I like to resonate with Paul. You know, Paul says in 2 Corinthians 4, therefore, having this ministry by the mercy of God, we do not lose heart, but we have renounced disgraceful, underhanded ways. We refuse to practice cunning or to tamper with God's word. But by the open statement of the truth, we would commend ourselves to everyone's conscience in the sight of God. And even if our gospel is veiled, and this is where I'm starting to get encouraged, because when I hear that Paul is tempted to lose heart, has reason to lose heart, to be discouraged, I think, well, as a pastor, I often am tempted to lose heart. And it's over this very thing that the gospel I'm preaching isn't always getting the attention and the interest of as many people, or the specific people that I want it to be interesting. But he goes on to say, our gospel is veiled to those who are perishing, because the God of this world has blinded the minds of unbelievers, and he is keeping them from seeing the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. But then he just says, what we're proclaiming is not ourselves, but we're proclaiming Jesus Christ. And here he gives the reason. And this is just amazing to me. He says, for God, who said, let light shine out of darkness, has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. So here's why this passage is one I reach for why preaching has to be important to Ryan, and why it should be important to pastors. Because he says, you may be discouraged because of the lack of response, but you need to understand why it is that people don't respond to the gospel being preached, because Satan has blinded the minds of unbelievers to keep them from seeing it. That's the reason why. Don't change the way you preach. Don't stop preaching to get more people to react, because you know why it is they don't react, because they're blind. And the question is, well, how then can blind unbelievers be made to see the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ? And Paul's saying, I'm not discouraged when they don't respond to my preaching, because I know why they don't respond to my preaching. And when I'm tempted to be discouraged, I'm going to just keep on preaching Christ, not myself, because God uses that in the same way he used his word in Genesis chapter 1. There was darkness and no light. And God said, let there be light, and light came. And what I'm understanding from that in Paul is that Genesis 1 and the way God uses his word, let there be light. He speaks it, and the thing that was not there, all of a sudden is there. And you just trace that through Genesis 1. And if you remember, ain't nobody said no to God in Genesis 1. Whatever he said happened. And Paul is taking comfort that if I keep on preaching Christ, he's going to use that with the same level of effectiveness that God did in Genesis with his word in Genesis 1. It's the preaching of Christ that gives the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ to those who are dwelling in darkness, to those who are blind and can't see. The only thing that will overcome the thing that discourages me is to keep on preaching. So we understand why it is that people don't respond, and we understand how it will even be possible for people in such a dark condition to ever respond. They were in the same condition that I was in, blinded in my unbelief, and God used preaching of Christ to give what I did not have. So even if you approach it from the posture of wanting to see people saved, wanting spiritual good for others, well, how are you going to do it? Well, for Paul, he's going to make sure he doesn't tamper with God's word. He's going to make sure he doesn't practice cunning to get more responses. He's going to openly state the truth. He's going to make Christ the point of his preaching. And he's going to trust that God is going to use it to save whoever he's going to save. Yeah. So it's a big deal to God. And if I could just give you one more aspect of this, and that is, it's always been a big deal to God. You know, we talked about page 1 of the Bible. God has always, as in from page 1, done all his good through his word. He creates through his word. Flip over a few pages, he calls by his word, calls Abraham from worshiping the moon to the real God. Flip several books, he convicts by his word. So he creates, he calls, he convicts, he sends a prophet to David, blind in his sin, right? At least when it comes to what he did with Uriah. And he uses his word to cause the king to see what he wasn't seeing. He creates, he calls, he convicts, he converts with his word. 1 Peter chapter 1 says, you have been born again, not by imperishable seed, but by the living and abiding word of God. He turns people from the dead through his word. And then he conforms those that he converts. He conforms them to the image of his son. How? Well, Ephesians 4:15 says, speak the truth in love, that you may grow up in every way into him who is the head, and become like Christ in every way. So when a pastor prioritizes preaching, he is simply getting on board with the way God does his work. It's always through his word. And if we're serving him in the ways that he wants, the word better be right at the center.
Yeah, fantastic. So it's the means in principle, but also in practice. It's the means by which God works, brings about his will, brings light into darkness. So we keep using that word preaching, and I understand that everybody sort of has their own baggage and background for what that word means. Maybe from what they grew up understanding. Maybe for them, preaching is a lecture or an academic intellectual exercise, or for some, maybe if they grew up in a particular kind of church, maybe preaching was a scolding, a 30-minute or 45-minute finger shaking. For others, maybe in today's culture, they might see preaching more as a dialogue or a conversation. So how would you define preaching? When we've talked about why it matters, but what is it?
That's good. Yeah, I think biblical preaching, and by that I don't just mean preaching the Bible, but a definition that would come from the Bible. It's something more than those things that were described, or something more than what some people would understand when they think of preaching. It's not necessarily whatever happens whenever the preacher gets up there with God's word. Yeah, I'm understanding preaching from the word in the Bible to mean heralding. And the question is, what are you heralding? Because that could conjure images kind of like what you described as a scolding. That could be, the preacher can stand behind the pulpit and herald judgment or herald what he thinks they need to hear.
Mm-hmm.
But in the Bible, preachers are preaching a word from God. So I think of it as you could say it just as simply as heralding God's word. But in that sense, if you're heralding a word from God, that starts to fiddle with the idea of dialogue. Mm-hmm. Though I think there's a sense in which the preacher is seeking in various ways to engage the congregation, and he may use dialogue as a tool at times, but is it primarily a dialogue? Mm. Well, not in Scripture, because God does all the talking. Mm. And he tells a person to then go and say what he said. Mm. And problems come to God's people when that person says something else than what he heard God said. There is something that happens in preaching that I think is very appropriate, where, and even if it's uncomfortable for the preacher, where the preacher is I think Stott, the title of his preaching book is Between Two Worlds. I think that's a helpful image for me, is there's a sense in which the preacher is between two worlds. He's standing in between heaven and earth. He's standing in between God and his people in ways that might be similar to Moses at Sinai, right? Where the people cry out after hearing God's voice. We don't want to hear from him directly again because we're so scared. I'm not saying there's that's totally good, but there's a sense in which they call him, please, you tell us what he says. You listen to him, and then you tell us what he says. And God goes with that in a sense. He takes that arrangement, and he speaks and reveals himself to Moses, and Moses is responsible then to then say the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help God. And it's only when people deviate from that there's a problem. So the preacher, I think, should see himself in that moment as a spokesman. He's not facilitating a town hall meeting. He's declaring, thus says the Lord. So it's heralding God's word, not our thoughts. And 2 Timothy 3, right? It says that all of it is God's word, and all of it is needed. Yeah. And I think about Deuteronomy 29:29 at the end of the giving of the law from Moses. He says, the secret things belong to the Lord our God, but the revealed things belong to us and to our children forever, that we may know them and do them. So preaching is not about secret things. It's not about our ideas that God has not revealed. It's about revealed things. Yeah. And there's an obligation, I think, on us as pastors to say, hey, Deuteronomy 29:29 still applies in this sense. When God reveals things to his people, he means for them to know them, because he also means for them to do them. And so the pastor is responsible to discover not the secret things, not to talk about whatever he wants, but to study what God has revealed, to know what it means so that he can say it and they can know it, and then help them to understand how then they're to do it, because God means for us to do it. I think, so when I think about a definition of preaching, I'm gonna lay out, I guess, an encouragement toward a certain commitment about preaching, which is that exposition is perhaps the best model for how we think about what we're doing when we preach, where we study God's word to discover what God says, and then we expose that. We reveal that. We preach that. Expositional preaching that starts with the text, and rather than our ideas about what we want to say or what they need to hear, we start with the text, and then through study with the Spirit's help, we discover what is God's actually saying. So Mark Dever would just very simply call expositional preaching or describe it this way: the point of the passage is the point of the sermon. There's another definition. David Helm would say this brand of preaching, expositional preaching, is empowered preaching that rightfully submits the shape and emphasis of the sermon to the shape and emphasis of a biblical text. In both of those, though, we're bound. We're tethered. We're limited in what we're saying by what God has said. And I think, I'm convinced that that's a commitment of mine, that if I'm going to be a preacher, the main thing I'm doing week in and week out is exposition. And I understand that even as just an implication of what God says his word is, that it comes from him. And therefore it bears his character and his power, and it has the ability to save. It has the ability to reprove and to correct and to teach and to complete a person. And so if I want that for my people to be complete Christians, then it's going to require them being corrected at times and taught and exhorted. And that happens, and God's word is the thing that does it. And I want them to have all of it, because it all came from him, and he says it's all necessary. So who am I to pick and choose or predict what they need to hear or how they're gonna respond and what's the best response? So I'm just, week in and week out, there's something thrilling I'm talking to preachers, so you guys know this. There's something really thrilling about preaching, and particularly thrilling about preaching in this way, where you start a week and you don't know what you're going to say, but you gotta find it. And the way you find it is just by deep dives into that passage. And you may read it. I often read it on Monday, and I'm like, woof, I have no idea what this is about, or oof, I don't like this, or goodness, they're not going to like this. And then by Friday, and I'm writing, I just love it. And I know I needed it, and I know they need it, so it's just go on.
We're going through numbers, preaching through numbers. I'm preaching through numbers right now. And so every Monday I sit down with our associate, and we dive into the text, and we kind of work through sort of a modified version of the Simeon Trust worksheet. But it's going through numbers, especially, that has happened quite a bit, where we look and think, man, what is that? What does it mean? How am I going to say that? How does it apply in any way to my people? Certainly, where's Christ in that? Where's the gospel in that? But by the end of the week, I'm chomping at the bit to declare it.
Hallelujah. And I love it when that happens. That so often happens with me. And then sometimes I'm not chomping at the bit. Like there are also weeks where it's not coming together, or I'm not coming together. And yet it is an act of faith, isn't it, to walk up there.
Yep.
And to keep doing it. It's an act of faith that God's word will not return void. That's the only guarantee we have, right? Is that he sends out his word like rain. And that's the way fruit happens, is by
Mm.
rain. Precipitation is essential for any kind of growth. And he says, that's what my word is. If you want growth, you got to send out the word. And God promises not that it won't return void. And yet there are often times, more often than I wish, where I'm feeling that like feeling the not as thrilled. But it is an act of faith to say, this is true.
Mm.
And they need it.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to say it.
I'm glad you mentioned, you kind of hinted at it a couple of times, but just to kind of drive that point home, that preaching is not simply the transfer of information. It's not simply taking data and putting it in people's heads. I heard a story years ago that there was a pastor, and his son was making the argument, his young son was making the argument why he didn't need to go to church that Sunday. And his dad asked him why. He said, because I already know all the stories. As though that's what church was about, was just
Yeah.
making sure you knew all the stories. But it is a persuasion. You're calling people to, the end of that Deuteronomy 29:29, that we may know them, that we may do them.
Mm-hmm.
Calling people to respond, not just here, know these things, understand these things, but respond in faith to whatever that particular passage is calling to.
Yeah. Yeah. That, I was preaching 1 Samuel 4 this Sunday. It's just kind of a one-off sermon. We're in the series of in Revelation, but I'd been doing some study in 1 Samuel 4, so I preached it. And it's this moment in the history of Israel where it says in chapter 3, the word of God was rare in those days.
Mm.
And then all of a sudden, Samuel is raised up as a prophet, but as he's being raised up as a prophet, God's people get in trouble with the Philistines. And they're having this battle in chapter 4, and they lose 4,000 people. And they think, well, the thing we need to do is get the ark of the Lord in here, and then we'll beat them. And as the story goes on, it's the wicked priests, Hophni and Phinehas, who are carrying the ark of God into the battle, and they're killed, and 30,000 others are killed. There's devastating. The ark of God leaves. And one of the points that's made there by the text, by just paying attention to the text, the word of the Lord was rare. It starts to go out through Samuel, but the very word that God revealed to Samuel was, I'm going to kill Hophni and Phinehas in a single day, and I'm going to punish Eli's household. Eli dies in chapter 4 as well. So when the word starts going out, they were so accustomed to not hearing it that they weren't paying attention. And they drag Hophni and Phinehas in there thinking that's going to help them, when God's got a promise he's going to kill them.
Mm.
So the problem with God's people is not that they used to hear God's word or they've heard it before. It's that they haven't heard it recently. They haven't taken it serious recently. They haven't believed that he himself is bound up in his word, and you've got to handle it rightly and heed it. And there's this warning in 1 Samuel 4. You better, these Bible reading resolutions aren't like losing 10-pound resolutions.
Mm.
This is your life, and you better not get too far from it.
Yeah, that's good. That kind of leads into my next question, because you mentioned handling the word rightly. So what are some, and maybe just pick out, top 2 or 3, what are some major errors or pitfalls to avoid as we prepare to preach, but then also as we preach? Are there any places that you feel are very tempting to sort of wander into?
Yeah. So I've thought about this. I've thought about it in my own experience as a preacher. And I've thought about it just in my awareness of how other guys are struggling to grow as preachers. And so as I've thought about it, Dave, I've come up with some titles for this, if that's all right. Here it
Yeah.
is. One pitfall is Monet preaching. Monet was an artist, an impressionistic painter, who would look at his subject and then he would make little strokes. Like he would look once and then do 10 strokes. That's impressionistic kind of approach to painting, is a glance and then lots of work on the actual canvas. And that happens in preaching, where guys aren't looking long enough. They'll take one look at or one read of the text, and then they get a long way down their sermon. That's one thing. It's just not studying seriously enough. I think another pitfall, does this answer your question?
Yes, for sure. Yeah.
Another pitfall would be kind of Pharisee preaching, where it's all morals and no gospel. I mean, you could think Christless preaching. All of preaching. I mean, what is it that Paul said? We do not proclaim ourselves. We proclaim Christ. And Jesus said, everything Moses wrote was about me. He said, after he's raised from the dead in Luke chapter 24, the entire Old Testament is about me. And then he goes to his apostles and he said, you keep what you write and what you witness should be all about me. That tells us the whole Bible is ultimately about Jesus. Now we have to be careful in how we talk about Jesus from the passage, but we better be talking about Jesus in Numbers and in 1 Samuel 4 and wherever we're preaching, Song of Solomon, we're talking about Jesus, because Jesus has said that that's what preaching is about. Another pitfall, I'll call it Mosaic preaching, and I don't mean the first prophet of Israel Mosaic. I mean the another approach to art where you're piecing together different colors or patterns or whatever to make this one thing. Sometimes people approach preaching wrongly. I think there's a temptation to just collect all the best thoughts of the best thinkers and say and just kind of bring that into one thing and call that a sermon. So when people study, they give a loud voice to commentators or other preachers that they like who've covered that passage. I think that's unwise. That's not what preaching is. Remember, the Spirit of God has not just indwelt and empowered a few preachers. He is gifting each preacher. And so he's guiding us to understand. We don't have to have or copy or imitate the best thoughts of the best guys. And the other thing is, those guys were writing for different purposes than what you're doing on Sunday morning in Nakona at First Baptist Church. The Spirit is gifting this man to speak to these people. So the Spirit was doing something different with John Stott, decades ago. So we can be helped by commentaries, but we don't need to rely on commentaries in preaching. And then I'll give you one more, because I do think this is important. And forgive me for these silly names. Sorry, not sorry. Here's the last. Popeye with no spinach preaching. This is powerless preaching. I'll tell you, I was a Popeye with no spinach preacher for the first half of my ministry here in Graham, for the most part. And what I mean is, whatever it meant, I knew 6 years in, whatever it meant to be doing this in my own, in the flesh and in my own strength, I knew I was doing it. I knew that what I was ultimately doing week in and week out mostly was falling back on process and things I learned in seminary about how to study the Bible. In other words, there was a lot less dependence upon the living God. Christian preaching has to be spirit-filled, spirit-dependent preaching. Popeye ain't no good when Brutus shows up and he ain't had that spinach. And a preacher ain't no good, even if he's got the book. If he's not recognizing he can't understand that book and they can't understand that book apart from the Spirit of God illuminating. So I could kind of boil it all down to the major errors are in one form or another. It's not letting God drive the preaching. It's not letting the text drive the sermon. It's letting too much of you in it.
Yeah.
You know? So there's an illustration that David Helm gives about this that I think is helpful. A lot of preachers go wrong when they use the Bible in the same way that a drunk uses a lamppost. The drunk's on his way home and he's just trying not to fall down. And so he leans against the lamppost. He's not using the lamppost for what it is there for. And a lot of preachers do the same thing with the Bible by using the Bible for support rather than for illumination. They use the Bible to support what they already know they want to say, what they already know the people need to hear. And the Bible's just there to support it. But the Bible's not there just to support the man's ideas, to get what the man wants done or whatever it is. The Bible's there to illuminate, to reveal God. And that's how we need to use it.
Yeah, that's really good. That's really good. How does preaching then relate to, because as pastors, preaching is not the only thing we do. There's counsel and shepherding and administration, and certainly all the other elements that take place in a worship gathering. So how does preaching relate to are all those other things just sort of ancillary to that? Are they just peripheral? Or how does preaching relate to all that other stuff that we do, both in pastoral work and then also even in gathered worship?
Yeah. So I don't think those things are ancillary or peripheral. I see these things as connected to preaching. I see preaching as a source, a meaningful source for the other tasks.
Yeah.
One thing is just to be committed to the idea that preaching shepherds. Yeah. John 10, I mean, what has Jesus said? I'm the good shepherd and my sheep hear my voice and they follow me. Yeah. And we are under shepherds. What does that mean? I mean, the good shepherd is leading his sheep, and you know who his sheep are. They're the ones who hear his voice, recognize he's the shepherd, and therefore follow him. They trust him. He's going to take me to where the grass is green. He's going to take me to where the water is sweet. He's the one who's going to keep the wolves from me. So I'm going to keep listening to his voice, and I'm going to go, and we're going to make it to the promised land. Under shepherds then are those who are just, again, trying to listen carefully for his voice and try to just sound it so that what they're hearing when preaching is happening is the good shepherd's voice. So just commit to this idea that if you want to get them home, you got to preach. And understand that the sermon then is I think it is useful to other shepherding tasks. It gives you very specific things to draw from when you're talking to members after the service, and you're thinking, okay, I'm gathering with them to consider how to stir them up to love and good deeds. How is it that what we just heard from God, what specifically does love look like because of it? What specifically does good deeds look like because of it? What's going on in your week this week? And how does this apply now? It's relevant to counseling. I mean, 1 Samuel 4, I just preached, and my sermon was put your gain above God's name and you'll be sorry.
Mm.
And I applied that to the congregation through going to Mark 8, where Jesus says similar kinds of things. Don't put your gain above my name. Don't deny me. If you deny me, I deny you. And he says, if anyone would follow me, he needs to take up his cross and deny himself. You got to deny yourself, not live for your gain. And 3 days later, I'm in the counseling room. And what I'm doing, as I'm hearing one of our members who was in the congregation on Sunday, struggling through marriage and struggling even more severely right now because she is ignoring the Lord and prioritizing herself. And I'm calling her back to what we just heard on Sunday. It's useful in discipling, and whether it's the pastor doing it or we're equipping the members to disciple, where they're meeting together over coffee or whatever, and they just say to one another, this is what God impressed upon me when he spoke to us on Sunday. Will you pray for me in this way? And what was it that he said to you or impressed upon you? And how can I pray for you? So I see it as complementary to all the other shepherding tasks, and maybe that's not a strong a word enough.
Mm. And then also probably in relation to the other things that go on in gathered worship, that preaching would fuel our singing, and that preaching would, motivate our giving and our prayer. Would you say that works as well in those aspects?
Yeah. So Dave, you've preached at Redeemer Church,
Mm-hmm.
and when before you've preached, right, I'm sending you an email and saying, hey, by this day, can you let us know what's going on, like what you're preaching on, and I'm asking you to give me another passage that can be read earlier in the service that would set you up for your preaching and set the congregation up for what you're about to say. And I'm also passing on what you're about to preach to the people who are picking songs. I'm passing it on to the service leader who's picking other things like the special prayer that's going to happen. And it's recognizing the primacy of preaching, and it's trying to get on board with what God's doing and saying, this is what God uniquely has for this people this week. And therefore it's going to be a harmony of kind of all these elements.
Yeah.
Getting in line, lining it up with what the sermon passage is.
That's good. So one final question here. Obviously, we've got pastors here, and when we post this later, I would envision that most of the people watching that are probably going to be pastors. But if a layperson, a church member, should happen to watch this and has endured to the end, has persevered to this point, how make the case for them, just in a statement or two, why preaching matters for them. So, obviously, preaching is a big part of what we do. It's part of what we've been trained for. It's a big part of what we devote our time and energy and effort to. And so maybe it's not strange to think of a bunch of preachers sitting around talking about the importance of preaching. But what would you say to the church member? Hey, here's why all this stuff we've talked about is important for you.
Yeah, great question. I want my members, the members of my church, and anyone who would listen to this, to believe Jesus,
Mm.
who said, in John 10, my sheep are going to get home if they follow me by listening to my voice. So believe this. The preaching in your church is what gets you home. And you won't get home without preaching. So you have to hear from Jesus, and you hear from Jesus through his under shepherds. And you've got just too much in the Bible to tell you this is important. 2 Timothy 2, Paul says to Timothy, do your best, Timothy, to present yourself to God as a workman who is approved by God by rightly handling the word. So there's an obligation. And if you love your pastors, you want them to do their best. You want them to work hard because they're going to answer to God for whether they handled the word rightly. There's a lot of things they're not going to answer for, but whether they handle God's word rightly is what they're going to answer for. And all the verses surrounding that charge to Timothy is relevant to you as a member of a church. It says, if you listen to the wrong preaching, it will ruin your hearers. It says the wrong teachers ruin hearers. It says that false teaching upsets faith. And there it's like upset, like the foundation breaking in a home, falling apart. The whole house will come down. Your whole life will come down. Your soul will be ruined if you're listening to the wrong people. They'll lead you to the wrong place. So you desperately need it. And you should, this is the most important thing in what you look for in a church. And it's the thing you should be praying, I think, most for your pastor, is that they will know how to handle God's word. And you need to pray for him and pray for the sermon and pray for your heart to hear it, because heaven and hell depend on what we hear every week at church.
Yeah, super, man. That's so encouraging. On that note, let me finish with this. One of the ways, if you're a pastor, one of the ways that you can improve in the task of preaching, grow in your preparation and the act of preaching, is something that I mentioned back at the beginning, the Charles Simeon Trust and their preaching workshops. Ryan has hosted one there at Redeemer for the last, what have you done, 4 or 5?
Our 4th is this year, yeah.
Okay. And I've been privileged to attend a couple of those. I know CJ has as well. If you're a pastor, let me encourage you. It's probably too late to get on board for this one, but they have them all over the country. And Ryan has already the next one for next early 2024 in place. We'll put a link to that here, or at least to the Charles Simeon Trust website in the notes, so that you can check that out. But if you're a pastor, I would so encourage you to take advantage of that. It's incredible. It's challenging. It can be intimidating, but it is so valuable in being able to refine that task of preaching. Anything you want to say on that, Ryan, real quickly?
Well, I was 4 years into preaching, and I was frustrated with how I was doing it. I was struggling to move from what I was seeing in the study to what I would say in the sermon, making those decisions. And I didn't have much confidence in knowing how to make those decisions. What I'm trying to do every week, one of the main things I'm trying to do is protect my people from me, protect my people from my initial impression or what I think is important, or I just want to guard them from that. I want to guard the sermon from me. And Simeon Trust will lay out some steps to walk through in your preparation for preaching. That has been the best kind of process to help me grow as a preacher. We need to do our best. We should be making progress. We're told in 1 Timothy 4, God wants us to. So this is a way to do it. And would love to have you. If a senior pastor were able to come February 1st through 3rd to Graham, Texas of this year, you could contact me and I think we could get you in. But it's the first week of February every year, 2.5 days in Graham, and it's super helpful. So we'd love to have you in the future as well.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, any of you other guys have anything for Ryan before we wrap up?
Ryan, I won't ask you to elaborate too much. Just share as much as you want to. You mentioned one of the pitfalls of preaching was that last catchy one about the Popeye and his spinach. What was it that brought you out of that, and what helped you move past that pitfall in your own preaching?
Yeah, I realized it was something both in preparation as well as in proclamation. I wasn't dependent on the living God in preparation. I realized I was just going through the steps, doing the things I was taught, and I was able to study and find something to say. But also in proclamation, like the before kind of Ryan was someone who almost like didn't consciously say this, but it was almost like the document was the sermon, and reading it was preaching. You can get into this with like some people would mistake the Spirit's role in preaching where they would only think of the Spirit at work in proclamation and not in preparation. No, he's at work throughout the whole deal, and we need to be dependent upon him. So it's really just prayer more. It starts with just the commitment. I can't do this. Doesn't matter how skilled I am. It doesn't matter how many good examples I've had. I can't do this, and it will make no difference, unless the Lord does build the house, the workers build in vain. He's got to do it. So I'm pleading with him more. I'm fasting more on weeks that I'm preaching. I'm trying to fast 1 day a week to express my dependence upon the Lord and seek his power. And I'm calling my people, and I'm saying, this is what the Dutch used to say. If you pray me full, I'll preach you full. I desperately need your prayers. And I'm praying for you because I don't want the Spirit to stand against the sermon because you're giving yourself to worthless things all week too. We all need to be begging the Lord collectively, crying out to him until he pours out his Spirit. So I'm just so committed to the life of, or the role of prayer in the life of the pastor, but also the life of the preacher. So that's it. I mean, it's a simple commitment. I need him. He's got to do it. And that expresses itself in more prayer. And then it also affects some of what I'm doing up there. The document's not the thing, and reading it isn't preaching. There's an openness and a dependence and a desire even for the Lord to do something beyond what he's currently done when I produce the document. So those are just some of the thoughts.
That's really good. I see a cycle there that faithful preaching fuels our prayers, and then the more we pray, the more we place ourselves in a posture of submission and to receive preaching.
Yeah. And I'm starting to, related to that, it fuels prayers for Sunday evening and Monday morning too.
Yeah.
I'm pleading, Lord, help me to believe this won't return void. And I'm also pleading, don't let the devil steal the seed.
Yeah, that's good. Anything else, Jerry? You got anything?
No, thanks, Ryan, for joining us today. I've heard so much about you from Dave, and I knew that CJ was a part of those as well, and so really appreciate you coming and being a part of this today.
A privilege. Thank you.
Yep. So if you want any more information, if you're watching this later, you need any more information about Ryan or Redeemer, maybe if you're in that area down there in Graham looking for a good church, I would recommend that you get in contact with Ryan. And if you're a pastor, and it's not just senior pastors, there are other elders, Sunday school teachers, anybody who's in a position to teach the word on a regular basis could benefit from these Simeon Trust workshops. So I'd encourage you to check them out, reach out to Ryan. If you want to try to get in on this one, like Ryan mentioned, we would encourage you to do that. So thanks so much for tuning in, and we'll be back in February with another Third Thursday training. So appreciate it, Ryan. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, guys.